The origins of Gothic are very difficult to pin down. It is conventionally said that Gothic really begins, or Gothic fiction really begins, with Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto in the 1760s. And that was indeed the first of the Gothic novels, very rapidly succeeded by the famous Gothic novels by Anne Radcliffe, principally The Mistress of Udolpho and The Italian, and Matthew Lewis's much more salacious and perhaps challenging novel, The Monk, all published in the 1780s and 1790s. So that is the heyday of Gothic fiction. The early wave of Gothic fiction went on through the 1780s and 90s, when it was comprehensively reviled by many cultural critics, including perhaps most famously William Wordsworth. It then went on in the early part of the 19th century to produce several more masterworks, of which the best known still, I think, is the novel Melmoth the Wanderer by C.R. Maturin. And then it could be argued that the first wave of Gothic fiction is essentially over. But rather like the subjects of Gothic fiction, who continually seem to have an afterlife, to refuse to lie down and be buried, then Gothic fiction keeps cropping up again throughout the 19th century. Then at the end of the 19th century, we come across another recrudescence of Gothic themes, with a host of works with which we remain familiar. Bram Stoker's Dracula, Robert Louis Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray, and a lot of other works by slightly less well-known novelists, although some of them well-known for other things, such as H.G. Wells. So there is a reflowering of the Gothic in what we now tend to think of in the 1890s as the age of decadence. Since then, the Gothic has never gone away, and we can look at that in two ways. We can look at it firstly in terms of the number of cultural remakes of original Gothic tropes and themes, like Frankenstein's creature, like Dracula, which continue, of course, to go on and develop through popular culture and through films in particular right up to today. We can also see it in the mid to late 20th century flourishing of the horror novel. The figure who perhaps comes most obviously to mind is the American writer Stephen King. And horror was widely regarded as a more physical emotion, a more physical feeling. One feels horror at the thought of bodies being cut up. One feels horror at cannibalism. One feels horror these days perhaps as a reaction to seeing the end point of a road accident. Terror was generally seen as something more psychological, something more disturbing, but in a less brutal, a less full-frontal kind of way. And in the early days of the Gothic, that was seen as a kind of difference between the novels of Anne Radcliffe, which were seen as terror novels, psychological thrillers in a way, and, for example, Matthew Lewis's The Monk, which was seen much more as to do with horror, to do with the brute facts of rape, violence, murder, and so forth. There is a question as to whether that distinction has really survived and what it really means. But at all events, it does remind us of why we read books, and of course now in the late 20th and early 21st century even more watch films, which inspire us with terror, which frighten us, which make us go to bed shaky and give us nightmares. And I think there is no simple answer to that question. I think there's perhaps a number of answers. I think one is that perhaps part of us likes to be tested in that way. Just how much horror can you bear in a single evening, or how did you feel after watching the Blair Witch Project? Another part perhaps is a sense of measuring up to what we find to be frightening in the outside world, so that in a certain sense watching something or reading something which is fearful may perhaps make us less fearful in terms of everyday accidents, in terms of everyday life. That is also a possibility. And a third possibility, of course, is that much Gothic fiction brings us into contact with the supernatural. Now, we may live our lives professing that we don't believe in the supernatural. We may live our lives never being really convinced that we've seen a ghost. On the other hand, our dreams remind us all the time that there are things that we see, even when asleep, which are very hard to explain. And I think there are few people who haven't at one stage woken up in the middle of the night being completely sure that they haven't either seen a ghost or that one might at one stage appear. There is no culture in the world which is free from ghosts, or from the fear of ghosts, or from the belief in ghosts, and there never has been. One of the simpler ways of looking at the earlier Gothic is in terms of location and setting. The most typical locations for the late 18th century and early 19th century Gothic novels were in castles or in monasteries or convents. Castles being a residue of a feudal or aristocratic past, and monasteries or convents representing in some way Catholic religion and some kind of opposition to what's seen in British culture as the comparative clarity of the Protestant religion. But what is noticeable is that these two apparently different scenarios are often actually very similar, because what they turn out to be, once you are inside them, is labyrinths. It is impossible to find one's way around them. There is always darkness. There is always the threat of falling through a trapdoor or finding oneself in a lower level. These are scenarios, unlike the conventional house, in which there are no real maps. You can never tell exactly how to get out. You can certainly never remember exactly how you got in. So these are scenarios of imprisonment. They're also scenarios of claustrophobia, of being unable to escape, and they contain within themselves very often the threat of being buried alive. Of course, to see the idea of being buried alive in its most potent formulations, you need to look a few years further on into the mid-19th century and into the short stories of Edgar Allan Poe, who is obsessed with that notion of being buried alive. But that notion of being in a space from which there is no obvious exit goes right back to the heart of the Gothic. And as we look through the Gothic, we come across increasing numbers of those castles, of those places from which you cannot get out. We think, of course, of Castle Dracula, and of the way in which that relates as a feudal ruling place to the villages outside. We think of that frequently repeated image of the villagers storming or trying to storm the gates of the castle. The castle as a place set apart as something which we cannot ever fully understand or inhabit, but within which we might be imprisoned or lost. And a number of Angela Carter's short stories take place in similar scenarios, where we have the castle, the memory of the past, which still exerts its power, even though we sense that in some way it ought not to. What do these scenarios mean? At a social level, they mean the persistence of a past which we'd wished, in our desire for modernity, to be long since dead. But that power still seems to go on. At a more psychological level, I think that they represent the fear of being locked up inside ourselves, so that we cannot escape from the fortress we have made around ourselves. We have to stay there, and we are doomed to continue to explore that space, even if it means going down into the cellar or the basement, which of course is so often the scenario of more modern horror films and horror fiction, and finding out what lies down there. And that image of going down into the basement, into the cellar, is an image of going down into the recesses of one's own mind and finding out what is buried down there before one can bring it up to the surface and live again in the daylight. One of the major concepts related to the Gothic is the concept of the sublime. Now, the sublime is not an easy idea to explain or to understand. The word itself actually comes from the Latin sublimine. It comes from that which comes into your mind under the threshold, something which you don't fully understand, something which seeps in while something else is happening. But that was not the main way in which the sublime was understood in the late 18th century. The best way of explaining what the sublime meant then is through referring to the writer and cultural critic Edmund Burke, who produced a book called Of the Sublime and Beautiful, in which he talks about the sublime in terms of the experience you have when you are gazing up at a vast mountainscape, or perhaps at a huge waterfall. The experience you have of being tiny, being reduced to something truly insignificant, but seeing the mighty works of God or nature there above you. And I think in the context of Gothic, it's the mighty works of nature rather than of God, which is perhaps the best way of thinking of it. And so we find in the works of writers like Anne Radcliffe in particular, many, many elements of the sublime. Actions taking place in vast mountains, actions taking place in wild parts of the world. And the same thing structures the ending, of course, of Frankenstein, where the characters are lost in these wastes, which are themselves, in a way, sublime. But the sublime is more than landscape. The sublime is a sense that the world, nature, is far more powerful than you. There is a point in Wordsworth's poem, The Prelude, a very well-known point where he quails in disbelief and fear before the sudden sight of a mountain, which reminds him of the limitations of his own humanity, which serves to reduce the human to something which should be scared, should be afraid in the face of the might, the force of the natural world. And that feeling gets developed through the Gothic, which is in a way of assigning humans a place in the world, while at the same time suggesting to them that transgression of that place in the world can still be possible. There are these strange high places, these strange wild waste places in nature, but perhaps those too can be in some way explored. And one way of taking that forward is by thinking about that often ignored part of the text of Frankenstein, which is the frame narrative, told, as you'll recall, by, or in letters at any rate, involving Walton the explorer. Some people have asked, well, why is he there at all? Why do we need this frame narrative? We have the whole thing going on with Frankenstein and his creature, with the killing of Frankenstein's family, all these kinds of matters. Why do we need this frame narrative with Walton? And I would say it is partly because of the sublime. One way of looking at the Gothic is that it deals with transgression. It deals with transgression between the human and the divine. It deals with transgression between different parts of society, between men and women, between different classes. It does not respect a clear differentiation or division. It is always trying to get over certain boundaries, trying to move with certain taboos. And we see this very much in the forms of the central figures, the protagonists, which Gothic offers to us. If If we go back to one of the earliest of the Gothic novels, Matthew Lewis's The Monk, we there have a protagonist, a hero villain, the monk of the title, whose name is Ambrosio, who clearly is an intensely wicked man. He does terribly wicked things, the like of which you have never seen before. They are violent and they are horrible. On the other hand, he is in a sense himself led on by a demonic figure called Matilda, and therefore the reader, while condemning what Ambrosio does, nonetheless with a different part of him or herself, the reader's self, still can feel a certain sympathy for why Ambrosio behaves in the way that he does. One of the main figures of the Gothic fiction and of Gothic culture, is the notion of forbidden knowledge. This obviously has a much older provenance than the Gothic as we now know it. We think back to various past movements, the Rosicrucians, the Illuminati, these strange groups of people who professed to have obscure or occult knowledge which was not known to the main populace. And that, of course, is something we refer to in terms of the occult meaning simply that which is hidden. But in Gothic it comes to mean more about that which is taboo, that kind of knowledge that we shouldn't try to find, because if we were to, it would place us in the realm of God or of the gods. The oldest figure in Western mythology for somebody who tries to attain forbidden knowledge is the figure in Greek legend of Prometheus, who, as we know, attempted to steal fire from the gods. Now, fire, some people have said, is the very secret of how civilization began. In order for humanity to flourish, there must be fire, in order to make things, in order to warm ourselves, and so fire becomes a figure for that forbidden knowledge, and Prometheus becomes a figure for the struggle of humanity to attain the knowledge which the gods have forbidden us from having. And that, of course, takes us back to, again, to biblical myth and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and the notion that some knowledge is forbidden to mankind and we only seize it from the gods at our peril. And the main Gothic text which deals with that is obviously Frankenstein. Because in Frankenstein the dealing is with an attempt to bring life back from death. And that has historically been the great taboo. Only God can do that. And in terms of Christianity, one might think of the resurrection of Jesus Christ as a clear statement that only God can bring life back from dead things. Victor Frankenstein, of course, tries to do, and in a sense succeeds in doing, precisely that. Therefore, he attains to a kind of forbidden knowledge. But what is interesting about Frankenstein, the text, is that that forbidden knowledge is no longer thought of as a kind of traditional seizing of knowledge or power from the gods, but is very much thought of in terms of science, technology, in terms of new kinds of knowledge, which nonetheless should be treated with respect, should not be insulted. Because if you go too far with your curiosity, whether that be scientific curiosity or occultism or magic or necromancy or all the various strange ways of achieving knowledge which figure all the time in Gothic, then there may be a terrible price to pay. One of the things that Gothic does, and has done from the very beginning, is to blur the crucial boundary, the crucial taboo between life and death, between the living, the dead, and the undead. Gothic has always been to do with ghosts and phantoms, with that which comes back, that which cannot be laid to rest. This obviously occurs crucially in the form of vampire fiction, but it's also there throughout the Gothic. Two main things, I think, lie behind that. The first of those is that strange sense that many of us, I think, have, that death is not permanent, that those loved ones whom we have buried may come back at some stage, and that may be a loving reunion, or it may indeed be an absolutely terrifying one. The other feature, I think, which is picked up in Gothic fiction, which goes right back through much older culture than that, is the theme of everlasting life. The notion that death is only temporary and that one might return. And that, of course, was a very common theme during the 18th and 19th centuries. One thinks of figures like Coleridge's Ancient Mariner, who were condemned to everlasting life. One thinks of parallel figures like the Wandering Jew, who had to continue to roam the world until he could find someone to take his place. And one thinks then of the notion of death being both a curse, but also something of a blessing, because the notion of being condemned to go on roving the earth, whether in bodily form or in the form of a ghost, doesn't really constitute everlasting life in the sense of a blessing or a boon or something for which one ought to be pleased. It can also be a curse. And that notion of the cursed wandering figure, the figure who wishes now to be laid to rest but cannot find rest, is another figure one finds from the very beginning of Gothic fiction. One of the ways in which Gothic fiction tends to differ from earlier and other forms of fiction is that the strict attribution of the good and the evil, the well-behaved and the wicked, is often not very clear-cut. There is an image in the whole of Gothic fiction of a character, normally a male character, who is both a hero and a villain. And the great avatar, the great progenitor of that imagery, is often held to be the real figure of George Gordon, Lord Byron, who in the early 19th century was regarded in the famous phrase as mad, bad and dangerous to know, but was nonetheless widely held up as a kind of culture hero. That image of Byron gets taken up in various later stories, most importantly in the story written by his own personal physician, John Polidori, in his story The Vampire, the first vampire story written in English, which is clearly heavily dependent upon Byron. But as we go through Gothic fiction, we find these male characters who, on the one hand, invite our reprobation. They're clearly bad in many ways. On the other hand, we have a certain admiration for them. Obviously, Count Dracula is not an admirable figure. He's dangerous, he's violent, and he sucks people's blood, and we don't on the whole want to know about that. On the other hand, Count Dracula has an extraordinary dignity. He is, as he often reminds us, the last member of a noble race. We also need to remember, although this is a difficult thing to properly keep in mind at the beginning of the 21st century, that Dracula would have been a very honourable and reputable figure in one sense in the late 1890s, because he was one of the great Christian defenders of Europe, of Christendom, as it was then still occasionally known, against invasions from farther east. So Dracula was in one sense a defender of the faith, in a rather strange sense, but of course also the last remnant, the last residue of a feudal aristocracy which has to be buried because it cannot withstand the tides of modernity which are flowing through Europe. If we move on to Victor Frankenstein, then arguably one can see a similar matter in progress. Of course, to create his creature, bearing in mind the creature is never in the text referred to as the monster, the creature, the creation, and later on in the text to wriggle out of, creating a female creature who would be the creature's only hope of happiness. These can be seen as reprehensible. On the other hand, arguably, Victor Frankenstein is acting, if not out of love, at least out of a genuine scientific curiosity, which he believes will forward the future of the human race. He goes, of course, terribly wrong, but the reader's sympathies nonetheless are not unilateral, not single, not very clear, I think, in Frankenstein. Now, we could also talk about Wuthering Heights, and in a way that would be one of the most exciting examples. What do we feel about Heathcliff? He's brutal, he's angry, he treats people terribly, he treats animals terribly, he treats everything terribly. On the other hand, in a sense, he's often regarded as something almost more than human, as a kind of force of nature that we have in some way to put up with and even admire for the way in which he refuses to succumb to the normal boundaries of what we assume to be human. And Gothic is always questioning, always challenging those boundaries. We are usually too conventional in our acceptance of what it means to be human. That's what the Gothic narrative seems to say. There are other ways we can go, other things that we can be, and we shouldn't rely upon easy religion or easy boundaries or social taboos to prevent us from aspiring and to becoming what H.G. Wells called in the memorable title of one of his novels, Men Like Gods. One term which it's very interesting to think about in terms of the Gothic is the satanic. If one thinks of Matthew Lewis's The Monk, then the figure Matilda, who is, we suppose, responsible for the monk's downfall, is also a satanic figure. But we have to think about what the very notion of Satan means. Now, within conventional Christian religion, Satan has a very clear meaning, but one could argue that by the time of the early Gothics, that meaning has become a little different, because Satan becomes more of a Promethean figure who is right to rebel against God, rather than merely being the father of lies, the father of all sin. That comes out particularly in the writings of the poet William Blake about Satan. But Blake refers back to Milton's Paradise Lost, which has become perhaps the main identifier of Satan in more recent Western culture. And what Milton does with Satan in Paradise Lost is, at least in part, to present Satan to us as a figure who is admirable, not necessarily justifiable, but admirable in his resistance to the dictates of God, to the dictates of authority. Now, what is especially interesting about that is that Milton himself, politically, was a revolutionary, an anti-monarchist, somebody who professed to dislike and despise all forms of monarchical power, and to believe instead in a certain form of religious democracy. And whether or not we agree with Blake, we can, I think, see in Paradise Lost the lineaments of a Satan figure who is not only a villain, but who is perhaps also heroic in his rebellion, in his resistance to power, in his insistence that one doesn't have to simply accept authority as it comes along, but one can do something about it. Now, what one does about it may well be, in the end, impotent. It may be that one cannot, in the end, object to the power of God any more than one can upset for good the power of kings. And it may well be that Milton didn't even intend his readership to suppose that. But the fact remains that when one's thinking about Satan in Paradise Lost, one is, I think, dealing with a prototype of the Gothic hero-villain, not a figure one can simply write off as misguided, powerless, or even unnecessarily brutal. He may be all of those things, but he is also, in some sense, a figure for humanity, trying to say, no, we will not accept that we don't have the final authority, the final power. We have some power too, we have some authority. Now, it may be that can be exercised for good or for evil, but that is our human right, our human choice, to choose good or evil and not simply be pushed to one side of that scale or the other. As with the Gothic itself, it is very hard, if not impossible, to track down the origins of the notion of a vampire. We find them in ancient Roman literature, where they are known as lamia. They are, like vampires, bloodsuckers. They live on blood. And they are, like later vampires, unkillable. Now, vampires go through various changes, mutations during the course of cultural history. The very first vampire story written in English was written by Byron's doctor, John Polidori, in the early 19th century, simply called The Vampire. The next most famous incarnation of the vampire, I think it's fair to say, was a short story written by Sheridan Le Fanu in the middle of the 19th century called Carmilla, where the vampires are lesbian vampires. And then, of course, we come on to Dracula, that great statement about vampirism in the last years of the 19th century. Now, Stoker in Dracula was drawing upon various sources. He was drawing upon myths from the ancient past. He was drawing upon legendary from Eastern Europe, and especially from the region then referred to as Transylvania, now part of Romania. He was drawing upon historical figures from the past, who were certainly existent figures, Countess Elizabeth Báthory, Vlad the Impaler. Whether they did what they were supposed to have done as vampires, of course, is something which we cannot investigate. Countess Báthory was supposed to bathe in the blood of thousands of young virgins. This seems, in the remote countryside of Transylvania, an improbable scenario. Vlad the Impaler probably wasn't a vampire at all. He just liked impaling people, which isn't quite the same thing. But Dracula came to fuse those elements of myth, legend, and history into a version of the vampire which has remained compelling through to the present day. What is vampirism about? It's about the fear of being out of control, because the victims of vampires, so the fiction and film tell us, are always out of control of their own bodies, their own feelings. Why else would they continually open French windows when all of their instincts and ours just say, keep it closed? They are also subject to certain versions of desire, we assume, desire which again cannot be controlled, and which the vampire perhaps takes advantage of, or maybe the vampire is itself, himself, herself, conjured up by desires that can't be fulfilled any other way. It's very noticeable in Dracula, but also in some other vampire stories, how a lot of the action takes place in terms of what might be called an eve of wedding scenario. Just before the victim is about to settle down into happy married life, is about to become a thoroughly respectable member of society, thoroughly integrated into the culture and into the rituals of marriage and so forth. Just before that, there is a kind of eruption or explosion of desire, which we might say is figured in the appearance of the vampire. We could thus say, and many critics have said, that the vampire has to do with the return of the repressed, the phrase that Freud used, but which is, I think, quite obvious in its meaning. Namely, if there are desires that we have, and if society forbids us to fulfil those desires, they may not just go away, they may simply be repressed, they may sink down to another level of the mind or the personality, but then they may be reconjured, they may reappear under certain circumstances, especially perhaps at moments of pressure or at moments of ritual, and then we will find they've not gone away at all, or maybe that they're still there simply in our dream. Two of the motifs and plot structures which are common to many Gothic novels are revenge and the notion of inheritance. Now, revenge, of course, takes us back through a whole history of English literature. It takes us back to revenge tragedy in Jacobean times, to the White Devil, and to many other texts from that time. The notion of inheritance has always been interesting in Gothic because there's always the possibility of a very troubled inheritance. Inheritance may never be as simple as you want. With the goods, the things that belong to your forefathers, to your family, there also come the family ghosts. And this was a very evident theme in what we normally take to be the first Gothic novel, Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto, where the inheritance turns up in the form of ghastly body parts and various other strange manifestations which you'd really rather not see or know about. This is not the inheritance that you want. One term that is often used to think about these things in Gothic fiction is the old biblical notion of the sins of the fathers, the way in which things which your forefathers may have done, and about which you may know about or not know about, may be revisited upon you, so that your quest in the Gothic novel is sometimes to find out what is it that's been done in the past, which means that I have to suffer like this in the present. And in that sense, the Gothic novel has sometimes been regarded as a kind of version of family history, as the way in which things we don't know from the past cannot be banished, never go away, but return, quite literally in many cases, to haunt us. And of course we can think about haunting as one of the crucial motifs of Gothic fiction from the late 18th century right through to the present day, and of course much earlier than that, because haunting, the sense of there being ghosts on the premises whose origins we may not fully understand, is as true of Shakespearean tragedy in the forms of, most emblematically, Macbeth and Hamlet, as it is in the later forms of Gothic fiction. Another continuing aspect of Gothic is the way in which it recounts not only a history of the relations between the genders, but also a history of the relations between social classes. So that many of the settings for early Gothic include castles, include places of privilege. Many of the characters are aristocrats. The setting is very much feudal. And one of the explanations that's been mounted for that in terms of the Gothic of the late 18th and early 19th centuries is that this is a time when the middle classes are coming increasingly into power, but where the aristocracy is not yet willing to lay down the power which it has had, so that the relation to the aristocracy, to the feudal in those late 18th, early 19th century texts, is very much one of trying to put those upper classes to rest. But the fear, of course, and it comes out perhaps most significantly of all a century later in Dracula, the fear is that it is impossible to lay that feudal past to rest, that it will somehow return, even if in the form of the undead. One crucial question in Gothic fiction is the question of revenge. And this, of course, comes down from older forms of dealings with revenge in the culture, including revenge tragedy. But the critical question about revenge is whether it is ever possible to achieve revenge without succumbing to the very dehumanization which has caused the original crime. And often, certainly in Jacobean revenge tragedy, then the avenger ends up by being transformed into the very form of the person whom he is attempting to gain his revenge against. And so revenge is never a simple matter of being able to atone for the sins of the past. The danger is that you may have a legal or reasonable reason to take out your vengeance on somebody who has killed your father, your mother, your entire family. Hamlet again is an example of this. But the question is, how can you do that without becoming transformed into the very thing which you are trying to destroy? And we can also, I think, see that not entirely in a strategic or plot kind of way, but also in a psychological way. How can one entertain these thoughts of vengeance or violence without becoming something less than the person that you aspire to be? And we can go one step further. We can say, at a social level, how can one atone for or make up for the injustices of the past without becoming similarly unjust in one's dealings with the present world? And I would suggest that we see this not only in revenge tragedy, in Gothic, perhaps we also see it in every attempt to make up for history. In every revolution, it is difficult to make up for past injustice without becoming unjust oneself and without falling into becoming a kind of mirror image of that which you are trying to destroy or make up for or compensate for. In the early Gothic, in the original Gothic, the place of women was very clearly delineated. Women were innocent, persecuted, usually on the run, and had very little power of their own until rescued by a gallant hero. Having said that, I should add that relates to the classic Gothic heroine. And there are numerous other older women in early Gothic fiction who perform various parts: nursemaids, governesses, in some cases villainesses themselves, who at least abet their husbands in the oppression of the younger women. But certainly the main heroine position in early Gothic fiction is of being persecuted, not quite knowing where one is, and eventually having to be rescued. Now, the position of women in Gothic fiction has changed notably over those 2 centuries, and there will be those critics who would say that it's changed to reflect the changing position of women in general in Western cultures. If we think, for example, of the position of Cathy in Wuthering Heights, here we have somebody who is not simply being pushed about, is not being persecuted, is to an extent at least taking life into her own hands, albeit with, some would say, disastrous, at least tragic results. Not a mere victim of passion, but an agent of passion, just as much as Heathcliff is an agent of passion. That perhaps is the clash between them, the reason why everything is impossible. One of Wilkie Collins's great novels is called The Woman in White. In that, the woman in white herself is merely a ghost, but there is a character within that, Marian Halcombe, who is very much the main figure of strength within the novel. But if these are images of increasing female power, then there is also much which is halting or changeable in that. After all, the female figures in Frankenstein are mostly persecuted, oppressed, killed. Nothing much is going on there. The female figures in Dracula, although a little more powerful, nonetheless in the end are not, I would suggest, the main protagonists there. They're kept in, to an extent, subservient roles. There are examples in the 20th century, especially in later vampire fiction like the writings of Poppy Z. Blight and others, where we have powerful female vampires, powerful female figures. And, of course, we need to think about the writings of Angela Carter, where, certainly in The Bloody Chamber, we have a very different approach to how women might experience and remake their own desire, even when in the face of imminent apparent danger. Many of the male and the bestial figures in The Bloody Chamber do appear to proffer danger. Nonetheless, on the whole, the women have ways of getting round that, or taming that, or domesticating that, or remaining agents in their own right. And I think when you are thinking about the role of women in Gothic fiction, I would suggest that that is the phrase to keep in mind. To what extent are these women agents in their own right? Are they able to produce their own story as well as simply being victims within a story?